Hey, good morning. Today we are going to begin Domain 6, Read Aloud, called The Viking Age. It's really one of my very favorite domains in all of the core knowledge for third grade, mostly because when I started teaching core knowledge, I really didn't know very much about the Vikings or the Viking Age. And the more I studied, the more and more interesting it became to me. So I am hoping that you will really enjoy this unit as much as I do. We're going to start with a little bit of vocabulary. You'll need to know this vocabulary in order for the story to make sense. Banished. If you're banished, you're sent away and not allowed to return to a place or a country. Ferocious is fierce, brutal, and wild. Fjords. Fjords are long, narrow inlets of the sea located between steep cliffs. So you would travel a fjord on a boat, and on either side of the fjord, there might be a little bit of land, but there's mostly mountains. Glaciers are large, slow-moving bodies of ice and snow that form around mountains and valleys. They usually are rivers of ice. They flow like a river, but more slowly. Plundered means something that is stolen or taken. Raids, a sudden attack, often involving the stealing or taking of goods, or maybe even slaves. Okay. We learned about that when we talked about ancient Rome. And that brings up the fact that when we talk about the Viking Age, we're also talking about an ancient culture. We still have influence from ancient Rome in our Western cultures today. The same is true for the Viking Age, the Norsemen. We have influence of that, but the actual high point of their culture has diminished, and we're no longer in the Viking Age, like we're no longer in the Roman Empire. But there are consequences of some of the things that happened, and we'll talk more about that later. It's very interesting. So, Vikings, when we hear the word Viking, we like that word. The Vikings themselves are the warriors of the Norse people. The word Viking comes from the word in Old Norse that says Vikinger, which means pirate or sea raider or attacker. And the emphasis is exactly what these men were. They were pirates and sea raiders or attackers. The word Viking only applies to the warriors, these people that went a Viking. Vikings were part of an even larger culture or group of men, women, and children called the Norse people. And even though only some men of the Norse civilization became Vikings, the Vikings' impact on history was so significant that the Norse civilization is frequently referred to as the Viking civilization, and the time of the Vikings is called the Viking Age. The word Norse comes from the word north. The Norse people lived in an area of Europe called Scandinavia. And if we call them the Norse people, you can surmise where these people may have come from. If we call them the North people and they are in Europe, you can surmise that these people are from the north of Europe. So picture in your mind the map of Europe. You have done a lot of work with the map of Europe when we talked about Rome. So go north. If you planted yourself in Europe and face north, that's where the Norse people would be located. The Norse people lived in Scandinavia, which includes 3 present-day countries: Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These 3 countries make up an area that we call Scandinavia, the area where the Norse people lived, and from where the Vikings came. Scandinavia is a large area surrounded by water. It's surrounded by the North Atlantic Ocean, the Arctic Ocean, the Baltic, North, and Norwegian seas. Um, and that played an awful lot into the influence that the Norse people had. The Norse people were known by other names. Some of the names include the Nordic people, Norsemen, or Northmen. And they were named specifically for where they lived. Norwegians came from Norway, Danes came from Denmark, and Swedes came from Sweden. Only warriors who went Viking or went on raids will be referred to as Vikings in this domain. The larger culture or the civilization that the Vikings were a part of will be referred to as the Norse or Nordic people, or the Viking people, or the people of the Viking Age. Okay, this larger culture was made up of men and women and children who survived by fishing, farming, trading, and other occupations. That sounds pretty familiar when you think of ancient Rome, right? Most of the plebeians were fishermen, farmers, traders, or other occupations. Viking people were not one group who lived under the rule of one king. They traveled to and settled in many different places. It's true that Viking warriors were feared because they would often sneak up on others and steal their goods. But there's much more to learn about this whole Viking Age culture and history of this ancient civilization. One of the components of the civilization is religion. It's a set of beliefs and practices. The Norse believed in many beings, being called gods and goddesses, just like the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Greeks, and the ancient Romans were also polytheistic. Remember, what are civilizations? Civilizations are groups of people living together in a well-organized way that developed cities and villages. They have writing. They have leaders and laws. They practice religion. They grow their own food by farming. And they have different people doing different jobs. So we're going to keep that in mind as we talk about this Viking Age civilization. Chapter 1 is, who were the Vikings? Well, a long time ago, more than 1,000 years in the past, the Vikings were the lords of the sea. Vikings were famous as ferocious warriors who were feared by people because of their seaborne raids. Vikings were an important part of a Norse civilization that also had farmers, fishermen, shipbuilders, craftsmen, traders, explorers, settlers, and poets. As you heard earlier, the Vikings came from a part of the world we now call Scandinavia. To the north, the Scandinavian peninsula is bordered by the Arctic Ocean. To the west is the Norwegian Sea. To the south is the Baltic and the North Sea. It's interesting that if you have to go south to get to the North Sea, you must really be very far north. These seas are part of the North Atlantic Ocean. As you can see, the Vikings were surrounded by water. If a civilization lives near the sea, what kinds of food do you expect them to eat a lot of? That's right, you would expect them to eat a lot of fish and other types of seafood, and it was true. The Norse people did. The Vikings traveled westward across the Atlantic Ocean to North America, and they traveled eastward to Russia and beyond. They even traveled as far as Persia, which is called Iran today. They left a deep imprint on many parts of Europe and surrounding islands, and they established settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, which is now Newfoundland. Some of those places still bear the names that were given by the Vikings more than 1,000 years ago. Viking expansion was made possible by their magnificent longships. The longships are icons of the Viking Age. The sight of longships struck fear into the hearts of others, but they were highly valued by the Vikings, who celebrated the ships in poetry and gave them as gifts. Excuse me just a moment. The sight of a longship struck fear into the hearts of others, but they were highly valued by the Vikings, who celebrated the ships in poetry, gave them as gifts. They even used them in funeral rituals. The exact causes of the Viking expansion during this time sort of remain mysterious. Some possible reasons include competition for resources, the lure of wealth and resources in Europe and other places, an increasing number of people in need of more food, changes with rulers, warfare, and the desire to win fame and fortune. We know for certain that the Vikings used their magnificent longships and other types of ships that you'll learn about later to explore, to trade, raid, and invade new lands. When the Vikings first ventured away from Scandinavia in their longships, they raided and plundered foreign settlements, terrifying the local inhabitants. Vikings were also called Norsemen, which means Northmen. This name came from people they raided who were living in England and other parts of Europe. After these raids, the Vikings returned home again with their plundered goods. Over time, however, the Vikings began to settle in and sometimes conquer the lands that they had raided and plundered. Okay, the Vikings, or Norsemen, began regular raids on Ireland, England, and other parts of Europe, including present-day Spain, France, Germany, and Russia. Viking warriors were known to kill without mercy and would steal anything of value, including people they could use as slaves. That sounds familiar also, doesn't it, in ancient cultures? However, Norsemen didn't just raid and steal. They also traded. Their cargo ships, rather than warships, carrying items from their home like fish, furs, timber. Timber are wooden logs, walrus ivory and hides, and woolen clothes, sailed on major rivers across Europe and into Russia. They traded these items for silver or for things that they did not have in their homeland. So the Vikings would go raiding and the Norsemen would go trading. Did you know that the Vikings set foot in what is now called North America long before Christopher Columbus did? As you heard earlier, after sailing to Iceland, the Norsemen traveled all the way to the large island of Greenland and then to the much smaller island of Vinland, which is now called Newfoundland. Newfoundland is part of the North American country of Canada. The Vikings were able to sail to these faraway places because they were such expert shipbuilders and navigators. To start at what most historians believe is the beginning, a Norwegian chieftain named Ingolfur Arnarsson, who would later be called just Ingolf, and his family, so Ingolfur Arnarsson, Ingolf, and his family left Norway and became the very first known settlers, Norse settlers in Iceland. Although the interior of Iceland is mountainous and contains glaciers, the coastal area is pretty good for farming. Ingolf and his family decided that life would be better for them in Iceland than it was in their homeland of Norway. Before long, many other Norse settlers in Iceland had come too, and a farmstead known as Reykjavik was established. One such settler was a name named Thorvald. Thorvald had been banished from Norway for committing a murder, so he traveled with his family to live in Iceland. Thorvald had a son This is an actual picture of the island, and there's Reykjavik. Reykjavik is still the largest city in Iceland. Thorvald had a son who went by the name Eric the Red. Eric the Red was born in Norway, but because of his father's banishment, he grew up in Iceland. As an adult, Eric the Red was also convicted of murder and banished from Iceland for 3 years. Eric sailed west from Iceland. On his voyage, Eric the Red came upon a huge, yet little-known island that he later named Greenland. During his 3-year banishment, Eric the Red spent several years exploring Greenland. He identified good settlement sites. Although much of Greenland is covered in ice, parts of the southwest, the deep fjords, valleys, and river portion proved to be good for Norse farming and settlement. We are told that Eric called his new place Greenland in the hope that the name would encourage people to settle there. And here's an actual photograph. You can see there are some areas without ice, but you can see tall mountains, deep valleys that are filled with glaciers. Glaciers are moving rivers of ice. Not long after settling in Greenland, the Vikings began to wonder what was farther west. Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson, Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson, I love the way they name their children, was one such person. Leif had once heard about a land to the west of Greenland from another sailor. Eventually, Leif set off in search of this land. As a result of his travels, Leif Erikson became recognized as the first known European to set foot in what was later called North America, establishing a settlement that Leif named Vinland, and that today is called Newfoundland. Leif discovered that there were already people living in Newfoundland, the Inuit. The Inuit are Native Americans who inhabited and still live in the Arctic regions of Greenland and North America. The Inuit were not pleased with having intruders. Leif's lack of supplies and the threats from the indigenous groups caused Leif and his men to leave Newfoundland. On his return journey to Greenland, Leif rescued a shipwrecked Viking crew and was given all the riches in the ship's cargo. That earned him the name Leif the Lucky. Much of what we know about the Viking Age has been handed down to each generation in the form of sagas or stories told by poets called skalds. Let me read that again because that's really an important concept and it really defines what this is. Much of what we know about this Viking Age and the Norse Age was handed down to each generation in the form of sagas or stories told by poets called skalds. Skalds were given the task of celebrating the achievement of kings, chieftains, and warriors. A skald was a historian who shared tales of war and preserved family history. The passing down of history by telling stories is called an oral tradition. Early on, the Viking people did not write down their history, but later many of the sagas were preserved in writing. So it started as an oral tradition passed on from generation to generation. As you heard earlier, the Norse people had their own mythology to explain the happenings of the world. In Norse mythology, Asgard was the home of the gods. And thanks to some modern movies, you probably know a lot of this terminology. Asgard was ruled by Odin, the ruler of Asgard, and his queen Frigga lived there. There were many gods in Asgard, but perhaps the most famous was Odin's son, Thor. Thor was the mighty god of thunder. Inside Asgard, which is the home of the gods, was Valhalla, a place where Vikings went if they had fought and died bravely in battle. Remember, Vikings go, I Viking, and they are the warriors of the Norse people. It was considered a great honor to go to Valhalla. 540 doors opened up into the palace, and through each door, 800 Viking warriors could walk side by side. Vikings are believed. They also believed in the power of magic. They believed in giants, ghosts, zombies, dwarfs, elves, trolls, and dragons. The Vikings believed in good spirits and bad spirits. Sounds like a video game to me. The Viking Age lasted around 500 years, and over time came to an end as the Vikings went on fewer and fewer raids to other lands. Their dragon-headed longships, filled with ferocious Viking warriors, eventually stopped sailing across the oceans. Several factors may have caused the Viking Age to come to an end. These include Europeans began to build hard-to-raid fortresses and castles. If you're going to get raided by Vikings, you might want to build a stronger castle. More Norse people began to own their own farms, and they needed to stay home to take care of their farms. They didn't want to go Viking. Some Norse began practicing Christianity. Christianity was a religion that taught that it's wrong to steal from and to hurt other people. And even though the Viking Age ended, the Norse people continued on and still exist today. They're known as Danes, Swedes, Norwegians, Icelanders, and Greenlanders. And although the Viking Age did not last as long as other civilizations, its Norse sagas and mythology forever remain with us, allowing us to learn about the Vikings' history, culture, and tales of adventure. Cool. So let me ask you a little bit. Who were the Vikings? Well, Vikings are warriors and sea raiders who were part of the larger Norse civilization. The Norsemen included mostly farmers, fishermen, shipbuilders, craftsmen, traders, explorers, settlers, poets, or skalds living in Scandinavia and the surrounding areas. So just like the Roman civilization, most of the people were plebeians or plebeians, however you would like to say that. Where did the Norse people live? Well, they lived in what's present-day countries of Scandinavia, which include Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Together, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway are called Scandinavia. And Scandinavia is surrounded by bodies of water, the North Atlantic Ocean, the Arctic Ocean, the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, the Norwegian Sea. Okay, so how did living by the sea influence these Norse people? They fished and they relied on the sea for food. They became excellent sailors and shipbuilders. They sailed through the fjords out into the ocean and all the way to other places in order to explore, trade, and sometimes there was raiding, but they also settled there. So they used their boats. They were a seafaring economy and civilization. People living to the south of Scandinavia called the Viking Age people the Norsemen or Northmen. And what does Northmen or Norsemen mean? It means northern men. The Vikings lived north of people living in England and other parts of Europe. What are some possible reasons why the Vikings left Scandinavia to settle in other areas? Well, their population had begun to grow, and there was not enough resources for living where they were. They needed to find other places to live. Some areas in Scandinavia were rugged and not very fertile. There was not a lot of land, or it was very cold, not a lot of dirt in the soil. There were conflicts between rulers and people, and sometimes people were banished. They were lured by the wealth and fame of other people, but mostly they needed some good soil in order to be able to grow crops, in order to be able to support their families. Most of the people were farmers and fishermen. And in order to be able to do that, you had to be near the water or have decent soil to grow your plants in. They needed to find places with good soil. So why do you think that the Vikings eventually stopped Viking or raiding the other lands and stealing other people's goods? Well, they might have seen how wonderful the farmland was, and they said, I would rather try to farm and raise my family here in England or Scotland or northern France or northern Germany than to try to do that in where I'm trying to live, where it's rocky, cold soil. What's the name of the continent that we live in that includes Greenland and Newfoundland? That's right, North America. And what North American country is Newfoundland a part of today? Canada, that's right. And who was the man that, he may not have been the very first person because he had to hear of this from other sailors, but he's the first person that we know of with an actual name, a real person who really went to Newfoundland, is Leif the Lucky, or Leif Erikson. He's the son of Eric the Red. And why were those guys important? Well, they were explorers, Norse explorers who expanded the Viking settlements. Eric the Red settled in Greenland. Eric the Red settled in Greenland. Leif Erikson, or Leif the Lucky, settled in Newfoundland. You know, the Vikings appeared ferocious as they raided and plundered foreign settlements. But they had more peaceful ways of making a living. How did most of the Norsemen make a living? They farmed, they fished, they traded things like furs, wood, walrus ivory, walrus skins, wool, and iron that they had access to. They traded it for things that they did not have access to. They didn't have gold and silver in the Northland. So they had to trade what they had for what they didn't have. That's the economy. Why are skalds important to the Viking people? Skalds were poets who were responsible for memorizing mythology and sagas. Those are historical stories. They needed to memorize those so that they could orally pass along the history of their people. The Norse people used skalds as a way to pass on their stories and history because at the very beginning they did not have a writing to write down their history. Later on, they did write it down. Why do you think they wouldn't write it down? One of the things they did not have was paper. If you don't have paper, what are you going to write on? Rocks. You might be able to carve certain rocks. That takes a long time and it's very permanent. A lot of writing we do, we don't necessarily want to be permanent if it's about trade. Oh, I gave Uncle Joe 6 dozen eggs. He now owes me a pig or some pork when it's, time for harvest. So those are the types of transactions that you don't necessarily want to write down on a rock that lasts forever. And they may not have had paper in order to be able to write those things down. Very interesting. Can you compare and contrast the Norse civilization and what you know so far with the ancient Roman civilization? How were the Viking people similar to the ancient Roman people? And how were they different? Well, they might have been similar because they both believed in many gods and myths. Both the Viking people and the Romans traveled and settled in new places. They both had slaves that they got by going and conquering new places. The Viking people were known for building ships. The Romans were known for building with their buildings, their architecture. Romans lived in a warm climate with some fertile land. Vikings and Norse people lived in a very cold climate with glaciers, limited fertile land. The Romans wrote everything down. They had written traditions, whereas the Norse people had mostly oral traditions that they passed down for a long time until the later Norse age, the later Viking age. They did begin to really write things down. And now they write more books and have more books per capita than anybody in Iceland. It's sort of interesting how things change. I hope you will enjoy our unit on the Viking Age. I find it very interesting.